Permission to come aboard?
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
And here we go.
Live from the Hollywood foothills of North Carolina, welcome to episode 113 of the Confirmed Epic Podcast, the official podcast of the Epic Review, and hosted by myself, the real Brad Bell. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate all you guys checking out the past couple Zack Snyder's Justice League chapter by chapter. We're at the halfway point of that right now, so I decided now would be a good time to take a little break and come back to the podcast proper. And of course, we will continue Zack Snyder's Justice League chapter by chapter here on the podcast feed. But today I have something a little different for you. I actually wanted to get into a few topics, things that's been on my mind, but I've kind of been holding off on because of the release of the Snyder Cut. And I actually wanted to do, I don't know if it's a first here for the Confirmed Epic Podcast or the Epic Review, but I wanted to dive into a comic or a comic arc, not an entire run, and I'm going to be covering Avengers' second encounter with the Squadron Supreme here on this podcast. If you do not know anything that I'm talking about with the Squadron Supreme, of course you all know the Avengers. They've been part of the pop culture zeitgeist since 2012 in a big way with the films and whatnot, leading up through Avengers Endgame. But if you don't know who the Squadron Supreme is, make sure you stay tuned for our main topic, which will cover the second encounter of Avengers versus not just the Squadron Supreme, but another name that they're commonly referred to in the comics, Squadron Sinister. And you may be like, I have no interest in this. This has nothing to do with the MCU. Where do you think this stuff comes from? Do not be surprised, especially based on recent events, if we see the Squadron Supreme or the Squadron Sinister in the MCU or on Disney Plus or in cinemas within the next 5 to 10 years. So go ahead and get out ahead of things while you can. But I thought it would be a fun topic to talk about. But before we do, there is a couple items that have really piqued my interest. Some of this is older news, but as far as the fruits of the news, they have not come to pass yet. So things that have been announced but have, of course, not been revealed. So the first thing I wanted to talk about that really intrigued me is that DC has announced that the infamous and legendary Garth Ennis is going to be doing a 6-issue Batman miniseries called Batman Reptilian, and it's going to be out June 22nd, the first issue of that. And to add to that, he is going to be joined by the great Liam Sharp, who comic fans will recognize most recently from doing the Wonder Woman Rebirth stuff. It was just jaw-dropping art. Liam Sharp is one of the best artists working today, so I cannot wait to see what he will do with a Batman arc from start to finish. I think Liam, his hard and edgy aesthetic should match the Garth Ennis vibe well. We'll talk about what the Garth Ennis vibe is here in a minute. And they have revealed a few of Sharp's pages, and you can find this at Newsarama if you want to check this out. You may have to dive back into the archives, but I'm sure if you search it, you can find these pages easily online. They've revealed some of Liam Sharp's pages without the word bubbles, of course, and the best way that I could describe those are immaculate and chilling. Now, you'll have to excuse me, by the way, I'm recording this way early in the morning. I may be taking a few sips of coffee, so I hope you'll bear with me, but we're always pretty casual here on the Confirmed Epic podcast, actually drinking out of my coffee with Kenobi mug, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Star Wars podcasts. So I always enjoy those guys. Check them out. But as I said, I think Sharp's aesthetic here is going to match Garth Ennis well. But what you get with Garth Ennis is R rating and then some. And DC is not shying away from that. This is going to fall under their Black Label, which has replaced Vertigo in recent years. And this is going to be an R-rated Batman book. Now, comic book readers knew that when they saw Garth Ennis announced. But if you don't know who Garth Ennis is, he is most widely known for his work on Punisher Max, which was the most hardcore Punisher stuff you could read in the early 2000s. Of course, he is known for his run on Hellblazer, John Constantine, which was one of the best titles that Vertigo ever put out. I have not read it. I have the omnibus, but I have not dove into that. He went from Hellblazer to Preacher, which was one of the most renowned creator-owned titles from the 1990s. And of course, most people are going to recognize Garth Ennis currently as the creator of The Boys. The Boys, of course, has been adapted to that hit Amazon Prime TV series. So Garth Ennis, definitely a recognizable name, even if you have never picked up a comic that Ennis has written. Ennis is entertaining, there's no doubt. He does hinge a lot on shock value and pushing the envelope. And unlike someone like a Mark Millar, who is known for writing Civil War, Kick-Ass, Superior, the upcoming, about to be a Netflix show, the comic that's based on called Jupiter's Legacy, he has a lot of heart to match kind of the heftiness of what he throws at you. Talking about Mark Millar, sometimes Garth Ennis does not. It is a very Machiavellian take or view of the world. Even though he has a religious bent to a lot of his work, it's sometimes the worst part of what those religions have to offer without the hope that many people find in them. So how is that going to work out on Batman? I have no idea. I think if Ennis was going to do one of the mainstream DC characters, then Batman would be the one. But it's been a while since we've had what would be, I would say, deemed as an R-rated Batman book. But it has been done, and there has been some that have been done fairly recently. Some ones that come to mind, of course, number one is The Killing Joke by Alamo and Brian Boland. That story, originally out of continuity, an original graphic novel, was so popular and so well written by Alan Moore that DC decided to put it into continuity. And that meant some big changes for some characters in DC, mainly Barbara Gordon's Batgirl. If you have not read that story, I'm going to just give it's a big spoiler, but I'm going to try to be brief. I don't want to spoil The Killing Joke. That would be a fun one to talk about one day here on the Confirmed Epic podcast. Maybe fun's not the right word, an interesting one to talk about. In that story, Joker breaks into Barbara Gordon's apartment, and there is an implied rape, but before that, he shoots her in the back and paralyzes her. And of course, the Joker's the most heinous villain to ever be portrayed on the comic book page. So if this is shocking to you, I'm sorry, but if the Joker's just a terrible, terrible human being, he's evil incarnate, if you will. But what happens there is with Barbara Gordon becoming paralyzed, no longer being able to be Batgirl, she becomes the character of Oracle, who for most of the 90s and half of the 2000s run, and even in the Arkham video games, if you played those, is kind kind of the voice in the ear of Batman. She runs all of his field ops, and even more so than Alfred is Bruce Wayne's go-to, the Batman's go-to, as his eyes in the cowl. Now, I love Batgirl. I love Oracle. There are people who have their preferences. It probably depends on when you started reading DC Comics. When I really got into it, she was Oracle, so I always was fond of Oracle. They brought her back. They retconned some of that stuff for the New 52. So she, of course, has been Batgirl since about, I guess that would have been 2011. But that was based on, obviously, what I just told you. A hard R-rated dark book is now considered DC Black Label, which has a rebranding of their more mature content. So that is probably the most famous example. You have Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious Earth, where you had a sleep-deprived and very young and up-and-coming Grant Morrison give his take on the hellscape that is Arkham Asylum, the infamous prison that houses the great rogues gallery of Batman. And if you've never read that book, as someone who's feeling sleep deprived right now with 2 young kids and waking up early to do this podcast, I'm just tripping out thinking about that book. It's back here on the shelf. That's one of the first graphic novels that I've ever added to my collection. But check that out. It's definitely dark, it's demented, and it's a different take on Arkham. I don't think you'll ever look at Arkham the same. And then recently, I have not read this one. There was Batman Damned by Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo. And that was the one with the famous Bat Junk. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google that and you'll have a pretty good understanding. Those two also did a Joker graphic novel that seemed to almost pick up from The Dark Knight, even though that's not what it was intended to do. I read that about a year ago. We actually discussed that on the Confirmed Epic podcast. So why Batman usually, I would say, is more PG-13, not R-rated. There is a precedent for these R-rated Batman series or miniseries, and of course I think that is where Garth Ennis's story, Batman Reptilian, is going to fall into this. And Batman, again, usually a PG-13 book that pushes the boundary. It's tricky anytime you take a character as beloved as Batman, even though as dark as some of his stories can be, and you cross that line. Having just read the first volume of Punisher Max, while Batman stuff, the harder Batman stuff, tends to imply a lot, Garth Ennis doesn't imply anything. Everything's right there. It's in your face. It's gratuitous. That's one of the appeals of Garth Ennis, and he is not for everyone. And I'm wondering if he is for the Batman character for DC Comics. With not being not implying much, I could see this turning a lot of people off. Now, I read the first volume of Punisher Max, and I felt like borderline depressed after reading that. Now, a lot of that has to do with Frank Castle's a dark character. I know Batman is, but Frank Castle is an absolute lost character with not much of a moral code to guide his way. And after reading that first volume of Punisher Max, I kind of felt bad because I got both of these as Valentine's Day gifts from my wife, Abby, the mother of Beagles. Great gifts. But I was like, I don't know if I want to read Volume 2. Volume 2 is just sitting here in the shrink wrap. And I think I very well may end up selling these to buy some lighter books. Anybody that collects stuff, whether it's toys, statues, comics, know, hey, let the hobby fund itself. Sell your stuff to buy stuff that you want more. Sell your stuff that you don't want to somebody else who actually wants it. So I had a hard time deciding whether or not I was going to sell those. But Garth Ennis' Punisher is just something that my life would be much better off never revisiting. Now, other than Ennis here, the big news is this story is going to introduce a new villain into the great Batman's rogues gallery, and the name of this villain is the Reptilian. It seems like he is a cross between Killer Croc and the Lizard from Spider-Man, with obviously the darkest take possible, since this is going to be coming from Ennis. Having a character like Killer Croc already in the DC mythos within the Batman lore, I just wonder what, other than the extremeness that Ennis will bring, I just wonder what the Reptilian is going to bring to the table, to the Batman Rogues Gallery, that somebody like Killer Croc has not already done for the character. Now, Batman books have apparently been great lately. I have caught up through Joker War, and while that is kind of City of Bane meets the end of Dark Knight Rises with the Joker, it's very derivative of a lot of stuff. It was a great read. Last Night on Earth, which was kind of the end of the Snyder and Capullo Batman stuff, very futuristic, is supposed to be really, really good. My friend Paul swears by that. They're actually including that in the second Snyder and Capullo Batman Omnibus, which is coming out in mid-November, so I'm just going to wait to read that then. And then, of course, there was the Three Jokers that recently came out that was very divisive. It was very polarizing. People either seem to love or hate that book. I mean, Batman always gets the best creators, the best writers, the best artists, the best letters, the best inkers. He's the most popular comic book character, I would say, on the face of the earth, and he carries DC. So, and he's always the number one. Marvel can be holding all top 10 spots, but Batman's always that one DC book that's in the first, second, or third position. So, of course, Batman, he gets the best treatment, but that is the best return on the investment that DC Comics gets, is through the Caped Crusader. I'm interested to see how Ennis Batman book is going to read. I'll probably wait till this one's collected in hardcover, so it will be a while before I'll render my final verdict, but I'm still excited. So that is Batman Reptilian by Garth Ennis and Liam Sharp, and it is out June 22nd. DC also made a big announcement that on June 8th, they are going to release a DC Pride Month anthology entitled DC Pride #1. Now, June in the United States is Pride Month. That's, I guess, worldwide is Pride Month. That is celebrating the LGBT community. As someone who is not a member of that community, I'm not going to speak on whether or not these creators or the characters they have chosen will resonate, but I do think it was a big deal that DC beat what some consider to be the more progressive company, Marvel, to the punch when it comes to the Pride Month offerings. Marvel has plans for something similar. It's coming out later in June. It was announced after this, so DC was able to get the limelight on this, but let's hope that's not what it's for. I hope this is, authentic celebration of Pride, and I hope this isn't just a throwaway thing so they can slap Pride on the cover and then dismiss it in their books. I think they definitely need to recognize all creeds and all different backgrounds and all sexual orientations in their books. That doesn't mean that every book needs to be a political statement. I don't believe that at all. I believe there's a time for politics in comics and a time to just have fun, but you cannot ignore the issues. Comics, like any great art, reflect the problems, and they reflect the people whose voices need to be heard of their time. Marvel has been doing a book kind of like this. It's called Marvel Voices, And I think their Pride book, which I think is out June 23rd, whereas the DC one's out June 8th. The Marvel book will be the second under the Marvel Voices imprint. They actually had indigenous peoples celebrating natives and First Peoples, if you live in Canada, under that imprint that did very well covering characters such as Red Wolf. I know my friend Will Maney's a big fan of Red Wolf. He's actually got the first appearance of that character. This features a vast array of created teams. It's going to be anthology entries. We had a comics collecting comics in 2021 episode a while back. Thank you guys for tuning into that. This will be one along with that Garth Ennis book that we just mentioned, that I would consider picking up if I'm a collector. Definitely with the Ennis book, you could get the first appearance of the Reptilian. Who knows if he's the next great member of the Batman's Rogues Gallery. That could be a very valuable book. And this is the first time that DC is celebrating Pride Month, to my knowledge. So that could be a big deal. They'll probably print a ton of these. But that DC Pride #1 is out June 8th. That cover is absolutely stunning on this thing, so be sure to check that out. So before we move on to our topic here of Avengers versus the Squadron Sinister, our main topic of the show, I wanted to cover some things in movie news, or something that stuck out to me. Now, this is from early March, but we really have not heard much on it since, and it's something that I really wanted to talk about on the podcast. Alamo Drafthouse has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and will be bought out by a group of investors, and this is going to result in a closing of most of their theaters, including their flagship theater in Austin, Texas. However, the store, the theater, if you will, in Raleigh, North Carolina, is staying open. Now, Alamo Drafthouse, if you don't know, is the theater that partnered with Mondo, eventually bought out Mondo Galleries, and featured their artwork all across their theaters, featured their posters for the big movies coming out, like the Avengers, and got me hooked on Mondo art, which is now all over my house. And of course, even in this bedroom right now, I have the Tyler Stout bedroom / office / podcasting studio. I have the Tyler Stout Captain America and Tyler Stout Avengers posters. And if you listen to this podcast early on, you know how big of a fan of Mondo I was. And that always had pushed me as kind of a bucket list thing to make sure that I visited an Alamo Drafthouse and I took in all the glory that they had to offer, from the great food to the great drinks. Mondo and Alamo Drafthouse sometimes can get a pretentious reputation, but if you don't know what it is like to see a movie at a draft house, I do not, because I haven't been, but I've seen videos, I've read numerous articles. They really respect the movie-going experience. You go in, you're not allowed to have your phone out. They bring you have leather recliners, much like you do in many of the AMCs right now. Of course, this set the trend for all of that you see in mainstream movie theaters. And they have trained employees to bring in food and drink in silence. You actually, if you need anything, you write it down on a piece of paper. You have a very, very kind of like a book light at your disposal, so that the waiter or waitress can see that and assist you as needed. So they provide themselves on great customer service and food and drink, while at the same time preserving the sacredity of the movie-going experience. They have all kinds of special screenings where they bring in directors. They have special events where they will do like a TMNT, a pizza party, and they'll release with that screening a brand new TMNT Mondo print, which I was lucky enough to get my hands on, even though I don't have the room to currently display it. So now that they've been bought out by these investors, look, bankruptcy doesn't mean that Alamo Drafthouse is going away, but they're going to have to adhere to the vision of not their founder and original owner, Tim League, but they're going to have to adhere to the vision of these investors, which is going to be to get a return on their investment. That's how economics works. But at the same time, is the magic of Drafthouse, is the magic of Mondo going to disappear? As if a Thanos snap has occurred. Now, here is another thing you got to keep in mind. Alamo Drafthouse owns Mondo. They also own Mondo, the boutique poster gallery, which if you're listening to this podcast, you know what it is. They also own Fantastic Fest, which is one of the biggest pop culture conventions in the Southwest. And Fantastic Fest is not just movies, it's comics, it's music, there's concerts, there's screenings. It was one of the first cancellations last year when COVID really hit, that really had people dropping their jaws like, oh wow. It was almost the way the NCAA tournament was for the general audience, when everybody was like, wow, this is a huge deal, this COVID thing. That's kind of how Fantastic Fest was for us geeks. So they have Fantastic Fest. They also have a great magazine that they publish called Birth, Movies, Death that often features a lot of that Mondo art. So does that mean Mondo's gone? Is Fantastic Fest gone? We have no idea. And of course, the question that I have is, will I ever get to see a film in an Alamo Drafthouse theater? Luckily, the one in Raleigh is still open. However, we know with COVID still going on, even though it's going down, I've been vaccinated. We know that it's not the safest time to go to a movie theater, especially one that features dining, so you're not going to have your mask on as much as you would even in a normal movie theater. This is just sad. This is the realities of the pandemic. I'm hoping they find a way to restructure the business while at the same time keeping the magic that makes them different. I think the Hollywood location that has been hyped and set to open for a few years, that's not happening. There are several locations closing. And the first thing you got to think about is these people losing their jobs. So keep them in your thoughts. But don't want to be a downer, but I'm hoping that Mondo survives. I'm hoping that in some form or fashion, Alamo Drafthouse survives, and that's any business that has been stricken by this pandemic. So let's get into our main topic, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, the Avengers versus the Squadron Supreme. Now, you are going to have to bear with me here because this is a brand new recording setup that I have going on for this very special comic book topic. And if you hear the mic moving, I apologize. I've already had to move this mic like 2 or 3 times to accommodate this setup that I have here. But I think I've got it figured out, because what I made no notes whatsoever for this book. I actually finished this last night and woke up this morning, and I enjoyed it so much that I wanted to podcast on it. I have in my hands the updated version of the Squadron Supreme Marvel Omnibus that is covering tons of Squadron Supreme stories from their first appearance in the Avengers all the way up to their 90s miniseries, and of course their main miniseries by Mark Grunwald. So I have the book on a separate desk opened up, and as I talk about this, I'm going to be flipping through it. This may turn out great. We may have a blast doing it. It may not. We may never do it again. Only time will tell. Now, if you don't know who the Squadron Supreme is, They are an analog of the Justice League. And I had heard of them before, but I had never really read much of what they brought to the table as far as Marvel Comics was concerned. Hyperion, who is the Superman analog, by analog I mean it's a blatant ripoff of the Justice League and of the characters that make up the Justice League, such as Superman and Batman. Now, they first appeared in the Mighty Avengers in October of 1969, but that is not what I'm going to be covering here. I'm not covering the first appearances, as great as that was. I'm going to focus on the second big encounter. Now, there's multiple versions of the Squadron Supreme. There's the Squadron Supreme, which tends to be the more heroic version from one part of the multiverse. Then there's the Squadron Sinister, which of course is the more evil counterpart. The story features actually both at points, and I'm not going to break down every story beat. I actually got recommended this omnibus from Rob Liefeld's podcast, Robservations, and despite what you feel about Rob Liefeld, not many people in podcasting right now know the comics industry from the creative and business side like he does. You will learn so much listening to that podcast. And on his podcast, he talked about the first encounter the Avengers had with the Squadron. And that's great, but what really caught me was the second encounter they had with them. And I'm going to tell you the reason why. So this Avengers story features the story itself by Steve Engelhart, who wrote a ton of Avengers stuff back in what would be called the Bronze Age of comics. But it's the introduction. In fact, it says introducing a young George Perez. If you don't know who George Perez is, he is probably the greatest living comic book artist right now, besides John Byrne. They're not putting out content, but he and Byrne, but they are they're almost like the Beatles are to music. They are to comic book art. And what is amazing is how well this art, in particular the facial expressions, hold up today. And you may think, oh, I don't want to read any of those old comics. It's too many word balloons and thought bubbles and whatnot. There is a lot of that in here, but it's amazing how, with so much dialogue in here, how much the art of George Perez is still able to stand out. That was the style of comic book storytelling of the time. It does take you a lot longer to read a Bronze Age comic than, say, a modern age comic. But this story actually starts out, and the issues that I'm going to be covering start with Avengers 141, and of course that's from the original series. And this first issue, Avengers 141, was released November 1st, 1975. So yes, this is older content. This is when Nixon was president. But at this time, Cap has left the Avengers. The Avengers have considered bringing in Beast of the X-Men to replace him. But Beast believes that the Avengers would be better if their leader, Cap, was there. And there is something that has happened in previous issues that I'm not aware of, because I just read these issues on their own. I've not read every issue of Avengers leading up to this, that have rendered Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, and Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, who at this time was Yellow Jacket, hospitalized and unable to serve in the Avengers. So there's no Cap. He had stepped down for whatever reason, and you have the Pyms who are injured. So this is going to leave some spots open for the Beast and someone who has had a previous relationship in the comics with the Beast, a character known as Patsy Walker, aka Hellcat. If you're an MCU fan, I guess it's not technically in the MCU anymore, but Patsy Walker would best be known for being in the Jessica Jones TV show as her good friend. I only watched the first season and loved it. I don't think she became Hellcat in that show. And Hellcat's kind of a Catwoman analog. So the reason that I thought it would be interesting to cover the Squadron Supreme, and yes, in the earlier issues when the Avengers encounter the Squadron, they duel. But I think there's a lot more going on in these later issues, is that Marvel and DC, the biggest rivalry on the big screen now and on the pages back then and today, and with a few exceptions and a lot of caveats, we really haven't seen in the comics Marvel and DC characters interact. They do, but you can tell there are like 3 occasions that has happened, but you can tell there are these instances where DC has said, okay, you can use our characters, but don't do X, Y, and Z. And Marvel says, okay, that's fine, but when DC people are working with our characters, when we do these mega crossovers, don't do A, B, and C. So there definitely is restrictions. Now here I get that we're getting the Marvel perspective, but you're able to see kind of what writers such as Steve Engelhart and later on Roy Thomas would do, and artists like George Perez would do, if they were able to not have restrictions put on them by an opposing company, if they could have the Justice League and the Squadron Supreme team up. Now, the Squadron Supreme membership changes, much like the Justice League or the Avengers do over time, but let's just talk about the main members of the Squadron Supreme. So, you have, I would say, the leader is Hyperion, who is definitely an analog for Clark Kent, and he is a newspaper cartoon journalist. Let me say that loosely, journalist. He's a newspaper cartoonist, which I have mad respect for, especially being a comic books fan, but he's not the renowned journalist that Clark Kent is in DC Comics. So we have Hyperion, we have Dr. Spectrum, and Dr. Spectrum uses a magical prism to control objects and make constructs, so he is supposed to be your Green Lantern. We have the Wizard, who's super fast, who's supposed to be your Flash. We have kind of a mixture between, I would say, Mockingbird and Wonder Woman, and I'll even say a little bit of Black Bolt in there. Our main female character of the Squadron Supreme is named Lady Lark, and she can basically burst your eardrums at a very high frequency. And then we have the Golden Archer, who is supposed to be our Hawkeye. And we have other characters who are brought in here over the course of these issues. Again, the Squadron Supreme roster definitely changes over time. But in this story, we have dueling plots. So we have a part of the Avengers who are dealing with the Squadron Supreme, and Thor and Moondragon. Moondragon is a female god who I've only seen in like Infinity Crusade, Infinity Watch. She has not appeared in the movies. I think they took some of her characteristics and rolled them into the Mantis in the MCU movies, but she is definitely a much more serious character than the Mantis is in the MCU movies. But she and Thor are going to have to travel through time to find Hawkeye, who has quit the Avengers and decided that he wanted to leave this time period, which, I mean, this is a pretty crappy time period in the U.S. Altogether. And you're going to have this dual plot of half the Avenger, well, more than half of the Avengers dealing with the Squadron, and then Thor and Moondragon on a search for Hawkeye. Now, I will say that Thor in these issues steals the show, especially when we get to the climax. But I think if I was a kid or a teenager reading Marvel Comics at this time, out of all the Avengers, Thor would have been my favorite character. Now, let's talk about the Avengers team we have here. That roster is changing, but with Cap coming back on, we have Iron Man, Cap, Thor, the big three. We have Beast from the X-Men. We have Hellcat, Patsy Walker. We have Scarlet Witch. And we have Vision. And we have Hawkeye, who never comes back to the Avengers in these issues. So that is our main Avengers team. No Quicksilver. He was in the first encounter with the Squadron Supreme, and it was cool to see him go up against the Wizard. Now, this, you see why something like WandaVision is able to be so successful, because there's such a great history of that dynamic between Scarlet Witch and the Vision that I had heard about, but had not read a ton of these Bronze Age comics, so I was basing my knowledge on stuff that I had read in the 2000s, the 90s. So it's cool to see the stuff that inspired their relationship here. But every time, and you get a couple fights here between the Squadron and the Avengers, of course, early on, the Squadron is going to best them. You're going to see Dr. Spectrum actually give Vision a run for his money. The Wizard creates a moving tornado out of his speed to take Iron Man down out of the sky. And Lady Lark actually is able to take Wanda down with her sonic vocals before she can use her hex spell. So they capture, by the end of the first issue, which is Avengers 141, they capture the Avengers. And then you have Thor and Moondragon going back in time. You get to issue 142. And we have, it turns out that the place that Hawkeye has decided to retreat to is about 1882 America in the West, so the Wild West. And turns out that when they get there, they find out that King the Conqueror has decided that the best way to conquer the 20th century, which is what they are in at this point in the comics, of course, being 1975, is to conquer the 19th century. So you have King, who is trying to obtain uranium at this time in the West. This crazy stuff is outlandish, but I had a smile on my face the whole time I was reading. Like, when I first saw this Western, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be awful. How am I going to get through this? It's going to be a slog. No, it wasn't. It was so fun. It was so much fun seeing Thor and Moondragon reunite with Hawkeye, and you had basically dueling cowboy groups going up against each other. One that King had manipulated, and of course one that Hawkeye had been a part of before Thor and Moondragon arrived. And they are going to have to do some really cool stuff to thwart King, who is trying to get his hands on uranium. At the meantime, or meanwhile, as it says in the comic, the Squadron has defeated the Avengers. They have been captured, and come to find out, you have the Squadron being used as pawns by the Roxxon Oil Company. I think that there's two highlights, but one of them of all these issues is not the Squadron versus the Avengers, but there is a train heist in which Thor, Moondragon, and Hawkeye have to heist uranium from a train in the West. And George Perez here is just showing you that he is a superstar in the making. He will probably most famously be known for DC stuff, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then, of course, his run on the Teen Titans. But here, as he's introducing himself to the world in these Avengers pages, holy cow, I don't know if anybody, Jack Kirby included, Oliver Coipel, Russell Dowderman, all the people who have worked on Thor. Of course, Jack Kirby being the first to create the Marvel Comics look at Thor. Of course, I know there's the Norse god. I don't know if anybody does a Thor and does motion better with Mjolnir than George Perez, which is saying a lot considering how good Kirby is with his original stuff. So you have that going on with the West stuff. Of course, Kang thinks he has the best of Thor and that Avengers group. He doesn't know that in his presence undercover, there's actually the cowboy version of Thor, as crazy as all this sounds, who will pull out not a pistol but Mjolnir and take care of the Western version. And meanwhile, we have the Western version of Thor will take care of Kang in that time period. And meanwhile, I'm glossing over. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of words in these older comics, but hopefully you're getting the main idea of what's going on. And I'm enthused about this stuff, especially when you consider how early in the morning we are recording this. And Patsy Walker is caught in the middle of this mess because her ex-husband actually worked for Roxxon Oil, and they have been the ones to recruit the Squadron Supreme. You get 2 epic Thor fights, by the way, in these issues. You get Thor taking on Kang in the West. Yes, in the West, the Wild West. And then you are going to get Thor later on taking on a killer whale. We'll get there in a minute. The thing that really sets the great artists of this time apart, John Byrne and George Perez, is their facial expressions. I think that Perez does the best, like, mouth and eye combination, whereas Byrne has the iconic mouth. It looks like they're smiling, they're frowning. They convey emotion in these smaller panels because of the word bubbles, opposed to the larger splash pages that we're used to in more modern comics. Perez and Byrne and Neil Adams, those three, were able to convey so much emotion in their faces, which is why you would probably put them with Jack Kirby on the Mount Rushmore of comic book artists, even over somebody like, say, a Steve Ditko. But when you see Thor and Kang's expressions as they fight, it's not just boom, boom, pow. It is like real tension and emotion in these fight scenes. And tears shed by Kang when he realizes he's been thwarted by the Avengers once again. I can't wait to see Kang in the movies. And he's going to be played by the great Jonathan Majors. So, we have a lot of stuff going on here between the Avengers and the Squadron. And what this is eventually going to lead to is that this squadron was pulled from the multiverse, from a parallel Earth, and the Avengers actually end up going to their Earth once they're returned there by Roxxon to hunt down the Squadron Supreme, or the Squadron Sinister. I think this is the Squadron Supreme officially here throughout this title. So they are going to cross over through the multiverse and on their home world take on the Squadron. And what they find here is a ton of political intrigue. The Serpent Society, or the Serpent Squad, has been actually manipulating the president in this alternate timeline. It's Rockefeller, who was a nominee for president who didn't win, and he had succeeded Hubert Humphrey, who was another nominee who didn't win. But in this timeline, Rockefeller is being mind-controlled, the president of the United States, by not the Serpent Society, the Serpent Squad, and he is basically using government to peddle corporate interest, and the Squadron Supreme are pawns in that. And of course, Captain America, being the noble patriot that he is, cannot stand for corporations running the government. He thinks the government should serve the people, not the corporations. I agree, Cap. But it's almost like this is what America would become if it put corporate interest over the interest of the people, and that's exactly what's happened. So there is actually some, not just this is almost prophetic in a way. And Cap, when he goes here, yes, they fight the Squadron Supreme on their Earth, but they also try to make, especially their leader, Hyperion, aware of what is going on, that they are corporate sellouts, not just them, but since the government they serve is, so is the Squadron Supreme, and he's able to open their eyes to that. So there's political intrigue here, and Wanda and Vision are tasked with actually taking the Serpent Crown from President Rockefeller and trying to destroy that. Wanda with her hex power, which is just whatever comic book writers of the time, and apparently the MCU as well, want it to be. We get to see here Vision versus Hyperion in an epic street fight over this Serpent Crown, which Vision best Hyperion. There's always kind of this debate, who is Marvel's Superman? You have the Sentry, who's not part of the Squadron, who's not in these books, who's kind of a manic, psychotic version of Superman. You have Hyperion, who's a straight analog from the Squadron, and you have Vision, who is in Thor. Those are the four I would say are the most comparable to Superman in the Marvel Comics universe. Of course, we have only seen Vision and Thor in the cinematic universe, but it's kind of like, who is Marvel Superman? My argument would be it is Thor. In a tie-in issue, we do get to see Thor versus Hyperion. That's nowhere near as good because it's not George Perez art in this omnibus. But man, I don't know if it's. I'd say Thor, but Vision here takes down Hyperion pretty easily. So they definitely established the power level of Vision in these comics, much like they do. Wanda has to use her immense power to control this Serpent Crown. Once they do, it starts to make the government aware of the pawns of corporations that they have become. And by the time you get to the end, you have Cap, Iron Man, Vision, Scarlet Witch, Beast, Hellcat, Moondragon, and Thor versus Hyperion, Dr. Spectrum, Lady Lark, Golden Archer, the Wizard. Okay, and here, as we get toward the end of this story, issue 148, we are going to add the Amphibian, the King of the Seven Seas. So there's your Aquaman and Captain Hawk, who is just a poor excuse at a Batman analog, and a character named Tom Thumb, who I have no idea what they're going for here. He is he kind of reminds me of like a Gorilla Grodd, so doesn't make much sense there. It does get a little outlandish by the time we get to the end, but I do think the overall message here about the government becoming corporate sellouts, you get to see Patsy Walker become Hellcat. There's great Vision and Wanda stuff here. Iron Man is trying to recruit Cap to come back to the Avengers. What's crazy is nobody, not even Cap, know that Iron Man and Tony Stark are one and the same. It's not like in the movies or modern comics where he reveals his identity. So it is kind of cool to see that dynamic play out. It is weird too when you get to these fights. It's like in big cartoonish letter, Dr. Spectrum and the Wizard versus Cap and Iron Man. I don't need to tell you who's going to get the better of that one. Cap's able to throw his shield before the Wizard can even use his super speed to get to him. I don't know if I believe that would happen if this was, say, The Flash, but hey, we're in Marvel Comics here. Iron Man uses his repulsor chest ray to which would now, in the movies and stuff, the arc reactor, he's able to get out of these Dr. Spectrum prism constructs. And of course, we know that the Squadron Supreme is going to end up on the losing end here. You have Hyperion, once the Avengers kind of wake him up to what's going on. There's a cool scene where Beast cosplays as Rockefeller with a Mission Impossible style like mask, and he explains to Hyperion what's going on, and the rest of the squadron realize how much pawns of the government they had eventually become. But our big finale, which is from July of 1976, Avengers issue 149, you have Thor and Moondragon return from that Western timeline to assist the Avengers against now the Roxxon Oil Company. So Roxxon has been abandoned by the squadron. The Avengers are back on the main Earth, so now Roxxon has to basically defer to nameless and mindless henchmen, but they have one more ace up their sleeve, a giant human killer whale named Okra. And apparently, according to this, he first appeared in Submariner issue number 23, says the editor, Marv Wolfman here. And this is where, as dumb as Okra may sound, probably not getting him in the MCU anytime. As dumb as Okra may sound, just as we got earlier in the Western timeline, Thor versus Kang, here we get a confirmed epic fight scene between Thor and Okra, and Mjolnir is just being used to full effect. Just the motion. Oh, man, there's Thor's having this internal struggle here because he's one of the founding members of the Avengers. Moondragon, who also considers herself a god, says that Thor is selling himself short by being a member of the Avengers here, and that he could do a lot more for not just Earth but the entire multiverse if he would basically claim the throne of Asgard, that of course we know the history of. He wants to be king of Asgard. He doesn't. Odin wants him to. He doesn't. Odin's alive. He's dead. Odin's asleep. He's awake. It goes back and forth through the history of comics. But the epic final fight scene here is Thor conjures the lightning with Mjolnir. He channels all that power within himself, and he is able to take out Okra with just the great boom hit with Mjolnir. And then at the end, you have Patsy Walker, whose ex-husband worked for Roxxon, brought into custody. Not the country. He's in the U.S. We're in the main timeline here, in the main universe. Not the Squadron's Earth. I don't know what you would call what Earth that would be at. Like, I know Earth 616 is here. This is the main Marvel universe. 1616 is the ultimate. I don't know what Earth the Squadron is from. I guess even I'm not that big of a comic geek. But at the end, you have some debate on going into Avengers 150, which is a big tease. Enough said. Stay tuned. Stan Lee says, who is not writing any of this stuff, but is still heavily advertised as Stan Lee Presents with this old Marvel stuff. And here you have, in this epilogue, after Roxxon has been defeated, Patsy Walker, Hellcat's ex-husband, has been brought into custody, this debate of whether Cap will rejoin the Avengers, whether Thor will stay an Avenger, and are Beast and Hellcat going to be granted permanent entry into the Avengers. So that's kind of where we leave off. As cool as it was to see essentially the Avengers versus the Justice League, with the Avengers versus the Squadron, it made me want to just keep reading Avengers. I'm like, oh my God, now I want to go pick up these Avengers omnibuses. 3 and 4 can still be had for decent prices, but 1 and 2 are way, way out of print. What is crazy here, though, is that after reading this, I realize how huge the Squadron Supreme could be for the MCU. And that's kind of where I want to end at to tie this back to the movies. Let's face it, as much as I love the Snyder Cut, theatrically, Warner Brothers has not got the Justice League right. Especially when you hear that they consider the Whedon cut to be the canon. That's their call, whatever. But I think I'm going to make a prediction here on the Confirmed Epic podcast. By the end of this decade, I think we are going to see the MCU do the Squadron Supreme, and people are going to, as popular as the MCU is, they're going to like the Squadron Supreme or the Squadron Sinister, whichever the good or evil version Kevin Feige chooses to do, and they are going to like them more than the Justice League. I think you're going to see more Hyperion symbols out and about than you may see Superman symbols if the MCU decides to do this. You're going to see more Wizard action figures than you will Flash action figures, and if the MCU decides to do this. And a lot of times Marvel will foreshadow with their comics, kind of testing the waters, what they want to do on the screen. Now, this is not with this stuff. This is old. This is from the 1970s. But if you have not been following current Marvel Comics news, their big event this summer is they're redoing Heroes Reborn, but don't confuse it with the Pocket Universe that Liefeld and Lee created when they were asked by Marvel and paid a ton of money to come back from Image to Marvel to do that horrendous, at least based on the art storyline. I have not read it. And there was Heroes Reborn: The Return. By all accounts are better. So this is the third time they're using the Heroes Reborn branding. But it's kind of like Secret Wars 2015. It was Secret Wars in name only. It was completely different from the original Secret Wars event. For example, it did not feature the villain, the Beyonder, which was the main antagonist in the original Secret Wars story from the 80s. But in this new Heroes Reborn, it's almost some House of M meets Heroes Reborn, because much like in House of M, where Wolverine woke up and he was the only one who remembered what it was like before the House of M with Wanda Maximoff and Pietro and Magneto ruling over all of mankind, he was the only one that remembered it before she changed the timeline. In this coming summer's event, Heroes Reborn, which I think launches in May, Blade, the character Blade, the human hybrid vampire hunter, wakes up, and he's the only one that remembers. I don't know what causes us to get to this point as far as the timeline change, but he's the only one that remembers that there was an Avengers. That on the Heroes Reborn storyline timeline or version, there was never an Avengers. The Squadron Supreme had been what the Avengers were for Marvel this entire time. So Blade wakes up. At this time, Blade is a member of the Avengers in the comics by Jason Aaron, at least my last reading. And he remembers being a member of the Avengers. He remembers what they meant to the world. But when he wakes up, the Avengers don't exist. There's no Cap. There's no Iron Man. It is just the Squadron Supreme, and they're celebrated like the Avengers historically have been in Marvel. So one character you didn't hear me bring up was the Hulk. He was really only on the Avengers in the early issues. And Black Widow, she's more on the Avengers in the later issues. So if you're more of a MCU fan and you didn't hear those characters' names, I just wanted to point that out. Considering I'm recording this way early in the morning, I've only had a half a cup of coffee. I think this episode turned out pretty well. This sit-up was weird to get right. I apologize if you heard me flipping too many pages, if that was annoying, or if you heard me moving the mic. It took me a while to get acquainted, and there's probably a better way I can do this. But man, I'm really, really looking forward to, especially this summer when I have some more free time. You guys know I'm a teacher, so summer always opens up a chance for more podcasting schedule-wise. I'm really looking forward to doing more episodes, especially now that I'm doing a lot of this solo, where I pull an omnibus off my shelf, read a storyline from it, even maybe not the entire omnibus cover to cover, and we talk about it. Maybe I can tell you even some more about the history of the publications and what was going on in the comics at that time. If that's something you guys would like to hear more of, let me know. If I don't hear anything, I'm going to assume you're not against it, so I may plan on doing that moving forward. And I appreciate you guys joining me back on the Confirmed Epic podcast proper, as we took an interlude here from Zack Snyder's Justice League chapter by chapter. But man, I had a ton of fun doing this. Comics are my passion. Even I think if you heard the tone of my voice get more excited and more enthused as we transition from the movie and new stuff to actually talking about the story in a comic, I hope that passion shined through, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And I hope that this will encourage you to go and read some of these Squadron Supreme issues. You don't have to go out and buy a big omnibus like I did, but if you have Marvel Unlimited, which is like $8 to $10 a month, all Marvel's back issues are on there. Check that out. I'm sure you can scrounge up a copy of these older issues in some fashion online, hopefully through Marvel Unlimited. But man, go check out some articles on the Squadron Supreme, some YouTube videos on the Squadron Supreme, and on characters like Hyperion and the Wizard, because as dumb as they may sound, I think there's going to come a time within the pop cultural zeitgeist that the Squadron Supreme could be on the same level as the Justice League or the Avengers if Kevin Feige decides this is the route he wants to go. But I think that's just about going to do it for the 113th edition of the Confirmed Epic podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Whether you're listening on Spotify, on iTunes, on YouTube, if you have clicked play, as I sometimes cheesily say, you have made my day. For this podcast, you can find it always at its official home, thepicreview.com, theepicreview.com. But the most convenient place to find this podcast today is youtube.com/confirmed epic podcast. The number one thing you can do to help our podcast is like our videos, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, subscriptions being the biggest thing you can do to help us. If you're on Spotify, that's how you get your podcast. Follow us on there. If you're listening to us on iTunes, go give us a 5-star review if this is a show that you enjoy. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for joining us for the 113th edition of the Confirmed Epic podcast. The condition that I'm in, I about said the 113th condition is a condition of happiness because you guys have been listening to the pod and interacting, and I appreciate that so much. So, once again, from the Hollywood foothills of North Carolina, we are out.
That's all I have to say about that.